Hello everyone and welcome to week 11. Today we'll be talking about assessing and evaluating organizational effectiveness. Thanks again for everyone's flexibility in moving to the video lecture. Along with watching the video lecture, everyone will also need to watch the TED Talk. The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong. So it just discusses some common misconceptions about charitable spending. So there will be a question on the lecture quiz related to this video. So again, along with watching the video lecture, you'll take a video lecture quiz that is on Canvas, and then you'll also answer a question related to this TED Talk. So when we're thinking about assessing organizational effectiveness, there's really two methods that you use. You both look at the organization's environment. So what's going on externally, what's going on around the organization, and what's going on internally. So those internal processes. And we will be talking about both of those specific areas. So when we are thinking about organization's environment, the first thing we kind of have to look at is the revenue sources. So how is that organization bringing in money? And are those revenue sources going to be stable over time? So first, if we think about how the organization's bringing in money, it's important that organizations have diversity in how they're bringing in money. So as we kind of talked about last time, organizations get their money from a variety of sources. So whether that be payment for services, grants, special events, government contracts. There's a variety of ways they can get money, and it's important that they diversify their revenue sources, because I kind of talked about a few weeks ago that I worked at a nonprofit and they lost a government grant that was like worth $1 million, and they had to lay off like a third of their staff. So they had to be cut in a third because they lost this one grant. So they kind of had a lot of eggs in one basket. And after that happened, they really moved to diversifying their revenue sources. So rather than having a lot of money in government grants, they really tried to bump up their fundraising. So they tried to bring in a lot more money through private sources, special events, individual donations. And that was really beneficial to maintain the long-term longevity of the organization, to make sure that they were going to be stable in the long term and not be at risk again of losing so much staff, so much money in kind of one swoop. What you also have to look at is kind of the stability of those revenue sources. So look at externally the foundations that you're applying to. Are those grants going to be renewable? Are you going to get that grant again? Is that foundation still going to be around in a year? So that's also important to consider. You also have to look at their relationships with collaborators and their competitors. So, there's other nonprofits out there who are doing similar things to your nonprofit. I worked at a child welfare agency that had the large government grant. There were other child welfare agencies out there who were competing for those same grants. So you have organizations who are doing similar things, and you can either view them as competitors or you can collaborate with them, because essentially you are competing for contracts, donations, volunteers, clients. A lot of people who might want to donate money to a child welfare agency might not see a difference between the one I worked at and the one down the street. But the other thing to keep in mind is that you can also pool resources to make things even better. I was also involved in another nonprofit that was did recreational activities for kids with disabilities, and we chose to collaborate with other nonprofits. Although we were doing similar things, we kind of realized, hey, we're all trying to kind of have these same activities for kids, but how can we make them even better? So we kind of all pooled our resources, pooled money, pooled, different connections we had to create like this large bicycling event for kids with disabilities. And that wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't been willing to collaborate, which not all organizations are. The other thing to keep in mind is diversity of providers and services. So if you're thinking about your providers, think about your clients. So what do your clients look like with regards to age, race, gender, etc.? Do your providers look the same? I worked at a child welfare agency, and all of the therapists looked the exact same. They were all young, white females, whereas the clients were very diverse. The clients didn't have one specific trend. So it's important that you do have people, you have diversity in who you're hiring as well. Some clients, maybe some clients are only going to be comfortable talking to females. Other clients are only going to be comfortable talking to males. And this one program I worked at had no male therapists. So it's hard because there are young boys who need therapy and are going to be more comfortable. Maybe they are more comfortable talking to males. So it's important that you do have that diversity. Also looking at the cultural competence of your services. So, there has been, let's think about like parenting training. Some parenting training, research has shown that some parenting training works better for specific cultural groups. Being parent from a certain racial group is going to change how you parent. So if you're trying to help those parents improve their parenting, maybe you need to kind of tie in that cultural competence piece. So that's definitely something to consider when you're developing the services. You also need to think about your client characteristics, kind of how they select your nonprofit, their access to the nonprofit. So client access to services is really important. And client access can be widespread. So if we think about access, I think a lot of us think about like physical access. So client physical access to services, this is your first lecture question. Client physical access to services can include transportation barriers, distance, so how far away is your nonprofit, and it could also be physical abilities. So maybe someone has a physical disability that prevents them from even being able to get inside the building. Maybe your building has no ramp and this person's in a wheelchair. Maybe the building has too many stairs and again, no ramp to help that person get in. So those are things you need to consider. When we're talking about distance, so again, I'm going to go back to the nonprofit I worked at. That was a child welfare agency. So we were in, this was in St. Louis, we were in South St. Louis City. That's where it was located, okay? Most of our clients were coming from North St. Louis City. By car, that's about a 30-minute drive. By transportation, public transportation, which is terrible in St. Louis, is like, that could be 1 to 2 hours on the bus. And you'd be having to take like 10 different buses to get there. So they really need to set up shop in North St. Louis County. Because it's just not feasible for people to get down there unless you're doing home visits, which that's what a lot of the therapists ended up having to do for their clients who lived in the North St. Louis City area, because they didn't have a physical location and it was just impossible for the clients to get down there. Some other client access to services that are not related to physical access could be that clients why don't clients access services? So think about other reasons that clients don't access services. One could be that they just assume that they're ineligible for services. So that does not have to do with physical access, but it prevents them from accessing it. They just don't realize they're eligible. And that happens a lot if you think about like food stamps, different other welfare programs, certain therapy programs. People might not realize that insurance does cover part of therapy. A lot of insurances will cover like the first 4 sessions. People don't realize that. So it's also helping people understand that they can access your services for free or for a reduced cost. The other thing to keep in mind is, again, as we're selecting our clients, is some organizations might be attracting more people than they physically can serve. So you have to think about what the organization's capacity is. And if you're over capacity, how are you selecting which clients kind of get selected for services? Some nonprofits they have different eligibility criteria that is going to be set internally or externally. So it might be that they have specific government grants. So it may be that because of this grant that they have with the government, they are only able to provide services to people within a very specific geographic area. That is very common. So if you don't live within the Manhattan city boundaries, you're not going to be able to access this specific nonprofit. If you are on the other side of that city limit, you're not going to be able to access them. That's very common. However, they also kind of deliberately screen out clients. Maybe they don't meet specific risk factor criteria. Maybe clients have to have so many risks in order for them to take them on, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the client has too many risks. There's kind of too much going on. We don't think we're going to be able to help this client, which again, I worked at a nonprofit and they kind of did both of those. So, when we had extra space, we kind of took in whoever wanted the services. If we didn't have enough space, then we were kind of doing what's called creaming the client. So that's where you kind of take the best clients possible. You want to make sure you have the clients who you are going to get the best outcomes for. So that's called creaming. It's not the best practice, but that's what happens a lot of times. If you think about like charter schools, that's a kind of a lottery system. So where kids, they have too many spaces. So they have to pick and choose which kids we want. So they might take the best kids out there, and that's going to help them get the best services. Again, fairly common at nonprofits. It just is really all based on what the eligibility criteria is for the organization. When we are thinking about assessing the organization internally, the first component of that would be looking at corporate authority and mission. So we kind of talked about governance earlier and the structure of nonprofits. So essentially, the first component of that is looking at the legal structure of the organization. So we had talked about this previously. So this is lecture quiz question number 2. So the legal basis for social service organizations. Again, it can either be public, private, or a nonprofit. So public is where it is a government agency, just like the Department of Family Services. Private is where it's not government. So under private, you have both nonprofit, where the goal of the organization is not to make profit. So the goal is that if they have excess money, it's being put back into the mission of the organization rather than being given to the owners. Also within private, you also have for-profit. So there are for-profit social services out there. So those are the legal basis would be public, private, nonprofit, and then for-profit. That's your question. Not mixed funds or whatever answer I put on the lecture quiz. You also need to be looking at the mission of the organization. So all organizations have missions. So if you look at any organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, they have a mission. So what is kind of the goal of the organization? We're going to be talking about mission later. So it's specifically looking at what's the mission. What do we want to accomplish? It's also important that you are looking at the program structure and the managerial style. So you kind of need to make sure that everything is built around your mission. If your mission is to end child abuse, you need to make sure that the programs you have are actually going to be carrying out that mission. You don't want to get into kind of what's called mission drift. So mission drift is when you start having programs that are really unrelated to your mission. So like I worked at a nonprofit that worked with kids with disabilities. Okay, so we worked with kids for a long time, and it number one, it becomes challenging because when you say you work with kids with disabilities, what age do people no longer what age are they no longer a child? That kind of varies. Legally, you become an adult at age 18. Specifically in the school system for kids with disabilities, you can remain in the school system until you're 21. So some nonprofits who work with kids with disabilities kind of go up to 21, some go to 18. But when those kids kind of age out, it's really tough. formed a lot of connections with them. Our board kind of put some pressure on us. Kind of, we're like, oh, well, why don't we still offer services to these kids as they age out? And we kind of decided, if we're serving someone who's 25, they have a disability, but it's kind of pulling away from our mission. It's mission drift. We have so many kids that we need to be serving. We need to focus on the kids. And we can kind of provide some referral sources when those kids do age out at the age of 21. So it's not fun, but people are going to become ineligible for your services. The other thing to think about, again, kind of going back to managerial style, do you have kind of how does communication work? So like when I had a problem, I had to talk, let's say I had a really big problem in the organization. I was like really frustrated with this really agency-wide policy. So in order to make a change in the policy, I really needed to talk to the executive director, okay? But one nonprofit I worked at, I couldn't just talk to the executive director. I couldn't just send an email to the executive director. There was 100 people who worked there. It was very much a hierarchical structure. So if we think about hierarchy, think about like a pyramid. In order to get to the top of the pyramid, you have to climb one level at a time, okay? So I was a lowly person at the bottom. I couldn't just send an email to the executive director at the top. I had to then, talk to my boss. So I had to go to the middle management level. I had to talk to my boss, who had to go to the senior management level, who would then talk to the executive director. It would take a really long time to make change. They'd put that in place because, they don't need 100 staff members bogging down the executive director with time, but it really does limit change from happening, and I think it does make upper management more kind of, they're not as aware of what the problems within the organization are. So they're really kind of unclear of what the programs actually look like when they're not directly connected to those individual program staff who are directly carrying out the services. Accountability, when it comes to organizational internally, there's kind of two parts to accountability. The first is looking at efficiency. So how many services are you able to provide per dollar? Okay, so if you are operating a nonprofit, let's say you're operating a nonprofit after school program, if you're spending $1 million, how many kids are you able to serve? Okay, so you want to make sure that for that $1 million, you're able to serve as many kids as possible. So that is efficiency. Effectiveness is how effective, I know I'm using this word synonym for the word. Okay, that's terrible. Terrible English. How effective are you at actually carrying out your services? So efficiency has to do with kind of how many people you're serving. Effectiveness has to do with those client outcomes. Are you actually making a change? Are you having an impact in the area that you want to have an impact? So that's lecture quiz question number 3. So what is nonprofit or organizational accountability with regards to effectiveness? So effectiveness, specifically, you're going to be looking at, do you have positive client outcomes? Okay, so it doesn't have to do with how much money you're spending, or how much marketing you're doing or your fundraising. It specifically has to look at, are you making an impact in the way that you want to be making an impact? So that's how you kind of hold organizations accountable, both that efficiency, how you're spending money, and effectiveness. What outcomes are you actually seeing? Thinking about technical resources, this has to do with, the facilities, equipment, IT, the data system. If you work in a nonprofit, there's a 99% likelihood that you're going to have some sort of database that you have to enter information into. If you're solely working off an Excel spreadsheet, that's not going to be the best technical resources. So most nonprofits have some sort of database. Even the super tiny nonprofit I worked at had a database where we entered client information. So you want to make sure that that database is really conducive to the work that you're doing, that it's geared towards what specifically you are doing. Technical resources and systems also has to do with the office space. Again, the location, the accessibility of the office for the providers. So now we're kind of moving into evaluating organizations, and evaluation really starts with the mission. So you have to make sure that the way you're measuring the impact is based on the stated mission statement. So again, whatever your mission statement is, it needs to be clearly articulated so that you can really look at the impact you're doing based on the mission statement. So you need to have in there, who are you serving, what are you doing, and what change you want to see, so that you can really kind of form those client outcomes around the evaluation, around that mission statement. So when you are choosing to evaluate a nonprofit, you need to know what the mission statement is. So when we're looking at different measures, again, they're all being related back to the mission statement. So if you think about the organization has an overall mission. From the mission, you kind of have this vision statement that's similar. But then from there, you have very specific goals. What goals do we have for our activities, for the clients that we're serving? What are your strategies for carrying out those goals? And then what specific activities are you going to be doing? And at each of these different levels, you need to be measuring your impact. Or your outcomes. Okay, so if we think about our mission statement, thinking about our overall impact, so these long-term objectives really need to be driving the focus. So if you're an environmental agency and your long-term goal is to reduce carbon emissions, maybe you have specific metrics on carbon emissions that you're able to look at. That's in the long term what you specifically you're trying to do. You also have goals. So we talked about goals previously. The goals tie into having activity measures. So activity measures are specifically what we've talked about, those shorter term goals. So it's the change, it might be the change in someone's knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. So those are the measures that you're going to be using for specific goals. And then when we're thinking about the activities, that's going to be looking at your capacity. So how many people are you able to serve? How many parents actually participated in your activity? So when we're thinking about how to actually measure organizational impact, so kind of going back to that impact, which is related to the mission statement, this is where it's important to make the mission quantifiable, okay? And we'll talk about some examples, but you need to be able to specifically say and point to, this is how we'll know if we have accomplished our mission, okay? And then you need to make sure you are investing in research to show if you're actually carrying out your mission. And then from there, you need to have these smaller goals to see kind of in the short term, did you meet your mission statement? So now we'll kind of look at a few specific nonprofit examples. So if we're specifically looking at Goodwill, this is a nonprofit example. So if you read the mission, Goodwill works to enhance the dignity and quality of life of individuals and families by strengthening communities, eliminating barriers to opportunity, and helping people in need reach their full potential through learning and the power of work. So that's Goodwill's mission. So it's a bit of a mouthful. But then if you go to their website, you can kind of see they have very specific ways. So here's our mission, and then here's our impact. So they have kind of designated on their homepage that they had more than 312,000 people placed into employment. So they have this overarching mission statement, but they have a way of specifically saying, here's how we carried out our mission, because we were able to place this many people into jobs. Another nonprofit example is the Council for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. So this is a national organization. You can read their mission statement, and then they specifically state underneath their mission statement, the impact was that they were able to train 1,150 professionals and volunteers to recognize and report child abuse. So you can see that their mission is to educate the community, and this is how they were able to carry out that education piece. Okay, that brings us into what we have going on this week. So worksheet number 2 is due on November 6th, okay? So it's going to be due in the same time that it was due before. So what you have to do for worksheet number 2 is look at the program goals. So what's your goal for the program? Review the week 4 PowerPoint for this, okay? So everything from this worksheet we have talked about previously. So go back, think about your logic model. This is going to combine kind of your logic model and monitoring fidelity. That's what this worksheet's going to be doing. So go back to your logic model. Look at from week 4, the program goals, both in the short term and the long term. What activities did you need to accomplish your goals? How are you going to measure your outcomes? So how will you evaluate whether you reached your goals? Okay. Then you have to do what's a fidelity measurement. So how will you evaluate whether your programs were implemented as intended? So review the week 5 PowerPoint for that. So when we're talking about outcomes, short-term outcomes are things that are occurring within 1 to 3 years. So these are going to be specific changes in participants' behavior, knowledge, attitude, skills, or level of functioning, okay? Short-term. Long-term, 7 to 10 years out, it's a fundamental change in the organization, the system, the communities as a result of the program. So that's the impact, long-term speaking. So you have to come up with both a long-term outcome and 2 short-term outcomes. Here are some examples of what would be short-term outcomes. How could you measure whether your program was effective? So again, you need to be establishing baseline measures. So you can do a pre-post test. You can have clients do a self-anchored scale, standardized test. You can pull community data, participant logs, knowledgeable judges, staff observations. All of those would work. Member surveys, kind of evaluating their changes, that would work as well. But it's not member surveys about the effectiveness of the program. It has to do with the outcomes. It's all about the outcomes. For the outcomes measurement, focus on the outcomes. The fidelity measures are different. So fidelity measures is that you are trying to say that our program was implemented how we wanted it to be implemented. The way that you monitor fidelity is through staff checklists, so they can say, yeah, we talked about this, we talked about that, we talked about that. You could do audio, video recording, so you can physically tape these parent training workshops that you might be doing. You can do interviews with staff on how kind of the process was in implementing the program. You can also do participant surveys. So this is where you might do like satisfaction surveys. How well did the staff member do in carrying out this program? You can do participant focus groups. All of these, again, they're tied back to making sure that your program was being implemented how it was supposed to be implemented. And here is an example of worksheet number 2. So this is posted on Canvas. So if my long-term goal is to reduce childhood obesity, short-term goal could be increase healthy foods, increase physical activity. So I have key activities that I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to be having, so you can kind of see that you need 1 long-term goal, 2 short-term goals. For each short-term goal, you need to have 2 activities, 2 outcome measurements, and 2 fidelities, okay? So you can see that I'm going to be doing healthy eating workshops. I'm going to be measuring the outcomes for the healthy eating workshops by having students take a pre-post test assessing their knowledge of healthy foods. My fidelity measure will be that staff will kind of have a checklist of everything, all the topics that they were supposed to have covered. And then I'll also be doing participant surveys to see how effective staff were in leading the workshops. So you can take a look that all are kind of structured in the same way. So you're going to have an activity. How are you going to measure the outcome for that activity? And how are you going to measure that that activity was implemented how it was supposed to be implemented? Again, if you guys have any questions related to worksheet number 2, please email me. I am happy to set up a time to talk, whether that be over phone or Zoom, or I can answer your questions via email. Any of that will work. I want to make sure that you understand this and that you're able to, that you have the tools to complete worksheet number 2. So please reach out with any questions.